Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much. Always these type of introductions always create expectations. So which are not always easy to live up to. But it's an honor to be here. They tell the story about this very corrupt politician. No names, so this is not a political. You can fill in the blanks, whatever persuasion you come from. Huh? They're all corrupt. Oh, okay, fine. He was climbing the ladder and getting more successful, but you know there's always pitfalls, and there's always challenges, there's always competition when it comes to corruption. And so one day he gets a visitor. The visitor's name is the angel of darkness. Other people call him Satan, some people call him the angel of death, you know, all these different names. And he says to him, I'd like to make a deal with you, and here's the deal. I will make sure that you'll be successful in every endeavor of yours, no matter how corrupt. And you'll never fail. And the price you have to pay is you have to give me your soul, your wife's soul, your children's souls, your grandchildren's souls. He listens, and you know he's very calm. He says, "What's the catch?" Okay, so the issue of a soul is complicated for all of us. Even those of us that are wired to be more spiritual in nature, sometimes we don't always know how our soul manifests. You can think it's something very soulful, and it could end up being just another form of arrogance. I know people who are very spiritually arrogant, for example, and they feel they're superior to those capitalists who are too materialistic. We live in a world that is complex. It's not easy to know what is right and what is wrong, and what is soulful, what is not soulful. You know, in the case of this joke, which I wish it wasn't a joke, is some of us get so desensitized, we don't even know that we're losing our soul. We don't even know if it's a problem. What's the problem? I'm sure present company excluded, but everybody has their blindness, and we all have our subjectivity. So, after hearing such a moving session, thank you for that. And in a way, what I'll be speaking about, I think complements it to some extent, is speaking exactly about that. What is the soul? And how do you recognize it? And how do you know that's the right voice? And how do you navigate in a world that's not always very soulful? You know, if we were all 7.8 billion people on Earth, all living up to our soul's destiny, and living up to our soul's mission and calling, we'd have a very different world, as we all know. But the question is, so why is it not happening? Who's at fault? Now, it's always easy to say, it's not me, I'm the soulful one, everybody else is the selfish one. So as someone who's traveled the world, I can tell you everybody's saying that. It's like, but the fact of the matter is we're all either part of the problem or part of the solution or a combination of their own. And to really be a person of integrity and honesty, you have to ask yourself, you know, what is soulfulness? Are you living up to it? And also be honest to know when you're not. And you don't always know, because we're subjective people. And subjectivity blinds us, and we sometimes think what we're doing is right and giving, and it could be very narcissistic and selfish, actually. And unfortunately, it's sometimes more complex than that because it's gray areas, not always black and white. So I'll throw out a few examples as my words that ask you to, by raise of hands, to say, what do you think this is coming from your soul? Or is this coming from, we'll use the ulterior to the soul, the alternative to the soul is what's called the body. Now, I don't mean the physical body per se, I mean the two voices inside of us. One we'll call the soulful, transcendent voice, and the other is, let's call it the materialistic or survival voice. And we have both of them within us every moment. Some are easy to identify, what voice, which side is coming from, and some are very difficult to identify, and some are a combination of. Kirk Douglas just passed away, right? Was it 2 weeks ago? The age, ripe old age of 103, 17 years short of the biblical maximum. So a young man. Now, Kirk Douglas, I had an interaction with him, interestingly, many years ago. So I thought it's a good place to share, especially connected to the last all given. So he had a stroke, I think around 25 years ago, perhaps, 20 years ago. Something like that, right? A stroke. And it caused his speech to be garbled. And he was in a situation where he was extremely depressed. Because besides the actual stroke, it creates a whole demoralized state. Suddenly all your faculties and your capacities, even though you want to do things, you can't, and so on. No one should ever know of that torture. And he would cry uncontrollably. I'll tell you why that's relevant. He would cry uncontrollably. And so he had one of his editors at Simon Schuster, who actually now lives in the old city in Jerusalem. She worked at Simon Schuster, and so she decided to give him a copy of my book, Toward a Meaningful Life. Why? Because the opening of my book, literally the first sentence in the first chapter called Body and Soul is, have you ever cried for no particular reason? And he read it, and not only did he read it, he internalized it, and they made contact to me. And later in his book called Climbing the Mountain, where he writes about his journey, including his Jewish journey, he has a whole section on it, how he was crying uncontrollably due to his stroke. And then he read in a book called Toward a Meaningful Life, have you ever cried for no particular reason? And the answer is, this is the voice of your soul. We always look at, well, how do we know when our soul is speaking to us? And one of the times is when it's crying for no particular reason. If it's crying for a particular reason, it could be due to you lost money, an illness, or even deeper issues, traumatic issues, pain and suffering. But when it's for no particular reason, why would you be crying? Why should a human being cry? You know those existential cries, you can just suddenly cry. You see a beautiful sight and you can cry, just in awe. It's not always in pain. So that's one of the voices of our soul. And for him, he says, it began my journey climbing the mountain. These are his words. Climbing the mountain because I recognize I have a soul inside of me. And my soul did not suffer a stroke. It was my body that suffered a stroke. My physical capacity, my physical faculties. So at the time I met him, and it was Ariella that introduced me, because she had given him the book. And we stayed somewhat friendly. I mean, it wasn't ongoing because he had his own life and he was getting older and he was doing his things. But I just thought, especially since he just passed, worthwhile quoting voice of the soul. But that's not the only voice. There are other voices. Sometimes the voice of joy, not always dead tears. It could be the deep joy we have of things that truly matter. But the problem is, as I said before, what some psychologists call the snowball effect. The snowball effect is that it's all mixed together, jumbled together. Our materialistic and survival needs and our spiritual needs are not mutually exclusive. They're all jumbled in one big picture here. And here's the real most bizarre thing of all. And whenever I say it to audience, everybody right away agrees. If you asked yourself, every one of you, how many hours a day you spend dealing with the second voice, survival. And by survival, I don't just mean hand to mouth. Survival means anything in the category of sleeping, eating, drinking, dressing, parties, anything that satisfies your social status and needs and so on. How many hours a day do you think you spend on that? We're not even getting into now, how many hours are you on your smartphone? Just wanted to show you I'm one of you. We won't even get that. I mean, a few years ago I was talking to a developer and I was saying, I was thinking of creating an app of like trying to bring more meaning into your life. And so he was suggesting, just like there's time management and there's other types of apps of managing. So we were sitting and one person said, nobody is going to write down and want to give a journal of how much time they waste a day. So forget about it. They're never going to be open to that. No one's going to write. They want to find out that I wasted today. You know, today there are on mobile phones. They can tell you how many hours you spent. Quite embarrassing when you see it. And then you look for ways to how do you get rid of this app. You know? I've been looking myself and I can't get rid of it. So it's a steady reminder of how. So how many hours? It's almost impossible to estimate. A third of our lives, they say we're asleep. And we need to sleep, no question. So we have 2/3 left. What about those 2/3? 2/3 of, the third. So 8 hours, let's say, average sleep, 8 hours, 7 hours, whatever the amount is. Yeah. So you're left with the rest of the hours. You're left with 13 hours, 12 hours. Huh? 16 hours. Okay, right, sorry. My math. Okay. And the answer most of us will give, you're right, is we spend a lot of time on basically surviving, paying our bills, all the means to ends, and we have very little time left for deep things we'll call higher values or transcendental needs. And the main excuse for it is we don't have the time. What am I supposed to do? I have to send my children to school. We have medical needs, we have health issues, we have aging. I mean, everybody's got their thing. So where is there room for it? So maybe once in a while during weekends, or I take some time off, a vacation in the evenings, I satisfy myself. Well, you come here for a soul conference on President's Day, right? Was that made specially that day? Because there you go. Because tomorrow we don't have time for our souls. So when you think about it, standing back, and this is not I'm not preaching here. Not a preacher. I didn't come to castigate anyone. We're all in the same boat. This is the world in which we live. And interestingly, we call ourselves emancipated because we have technology. Our grandparents had to struggle, besides not talking about the persecution and oppression, but simply to survive. 150 years ago, 200 years ago, you had to spend 8 hours in the field working hard to just get a sack of potatoes to be able to have dinner. So I was interesting, in 1957, there was an admiral, Admiral Hyman Rickover. Heard of him? Okay, he came from the pogroms of Eastern Europe in the early 20th century, and he rose to being the highest ranked admiral, which is 4-star. In the Navy, it's a 4-star, the highest rank. He's called the father of the nuclear Navy. He revolutionized the Navy, the US Navy. He gave a very powerful talk in 1957, which I know the statistic is just simply startling. And the statistic goes like this. Here we go.
There you go.
Is that him speaking? Like, recording? So the statistic is like this. He says that he did some research, and from 1857 to 1957, that century. In 1857, 94% of energy generated in the world was generated by human or animal labor. In 1957, 94% of energy was generated by fuels and machines. Now that's not a small little difference. And he spoke about one major implication of that was that the wealth, that's why wealth grew astronomically, because the people controlling the buttons in 1857, how much could you make already? But in 1957, since it's all industrialized, wealth went through the roof. And the second thing, which he doesn't really talk about much, but I want to focus on, what happened with all that free time? What happened with the free time that suddenly was freed? Now we don't have to sit and labor under the sun in a field or other types of hard manual labor. So what happened to the free time? You know what happened? It was the birth of a new entity. You know what it's called? Leisure. Leisure. We all have time for leisure. That once didn't exist. There was no leisure. There was no time for leisure because survival took over our lives. So this whole empty time, you'd think, if human beings were transcendental, soulful creatures, they would have filled it with soulful activity. No. We filled it with a lot of nonsense and a lot of ways to distract ourselves. And I didn't do full studies, but I can assure you that almost every type of addiction was also born in those 100 years because we needed to fill a lot of empty time. And we don't want to be in pain, so we have to numb ourselves. And how do you numb yourself? Through self-medicating one way or another. So what do we do with the soul's voice? We didn't use it to fill the time properly. We used it with nonsense. I always like this joke. It fits in here or it doesn't, but I think it fits. We'll try. There's this old Jew sitting on a bench. He's all depressed. His friend comes over and he says to me, "Uncle, why are you so depressed?" He says, "My wife is really angry at me today." He says, What's new? She's always angry at me. Today's something special. What happened? So she went to work in the morning and she asked me, "What are you going to do today?" And I said, "Nothing." She said, "That's what you said yesterday." I told her I wasn't finished. I wasn't finished doing nothing. So we have a new art, the art of doing nothing. And there are people who really, I meet people all the time. Remember, I don't know how their neurosis level is in Arizona. but in New York it's pretty high, average. And people are always talking about, how do you feel animal bliss? One guy told me a while back, he said, that's when I told him the joke. He tells me, Rabbi, I think I'm getting to a point where I do nothing and I don't feel guilty. I'm really feeling calm about it. And I said, what are you taking for that? Whatever. My point being is that we have a new concept called the couch potato. You can sit and do nothing. I'm going to watch. If someone says, you're into sports? Yeah. What do you play? I watch. I don't play. So all this is just a little, some social satire about understanding the world in which we live. So what happens to the soul among all of this? What happens to our inner soul? How does it get its time of day? And what are the consequences of that? And here we are adults. We're adults. We're already living in this world. We're already a 90-mile-an-hour merry-go-round, if not faster. And we can't just pause and say, I'll put a stop to my entire life and let me recalibrate and start anew. It doesn't work that way. So we have to have some type of formula that can work, that will work and we can integrate into our lives. But before that, how do we determine, going back to my initial question, how do we determine what's soul, what's not soul? So we actually have a beautiful verse in the book of Proverbs, Mishlei, that says the following: Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. The soul of God, the soul of man, the soul of a human being is the flame of God. Interesting. What does that mean? So flame is a metaphor. It's the closest approximation to what the soul looks like. No one has ever seen a soul. They've never seen souls. You've never seen your soul because our sensory tools, sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell, cannot experience the soul directly. So how do you know you have one? Good question. You feel it. You feel like you're alive. Is that your soul, biological life, that you breathe, and your heart is beating, and you have consciousness? So it's definitely a definition of soul on that level, but is that all your soul is? So how do we know we have a soul? There's some experience. Like I mentioned before, you can cry. God forbid, dead people don't cry. Dead people are not anxious. I don't mean to use a morbid expression, but I mean to say someone who's not alive doesn't have that type of those feelings. But there, on the other hand, there's a soul, but it may not be attached to a body. It's still there. So, how do we know? And I'll even put myself in the skeptic's shoes. I know here, you wouldn't be here if you were you would come to a soul conference if you didn't have any sense of soul, I would assume. Unless you came to find out what to rebut. But no, but the fact of the matter is, I by nature personally am skeptic, and even as a young child, and I always felt that I didn't want to take things for granted just because people told me so, my teachers, my rabbis, and so on. You want to really be able to establish it, to own it, so to speak. So to put in a skeptic's shoes, if you ask an average scientist today, many will tell you, especially the rejection of Descartes' Cartesian thinking, I think therefore I am, that there's two voices in us, the soul and the body. Some call that duality, actually. And the soul is just another electronic impulse in the human being. It's just another mechanical thing. Just like there's the physical part of your body, there's the energy inside of it. It's electricity like in a light bulb. And don't attribute it, this is I'm not saying prevalent, but it's pretty common, the scientific view of what we call consciousness. And life, many dismiss as being just like electricity, and has nothing to do with anything transcendent, and definitely nothing divine or sacred or godly. Any of you subscribe to that thinking? Don't be embarrassed. They won't be excommunicated, they say, right? Okay. No, anyway, I would assume not, but you never know. But this is not as uncommon as you think. So what's the answer to that? Because if they can argue that way, yeah, how do you know it isn't just a form of electricity that we, humans, in our own delusions, are trying to give it more value than it really deserves? So I'll give you a few, can I give you 100% proof? I don't know if I can give a scientific proof, but there's definitely others. There's a famous analogy that Sir Arthur Eddington, who was a physicist in the 1920s, 100 years ago. You got to say 1920s now, we're already in 20s now. Well, time is flying. Okay. Yeah, I come from the previous century. So you do, right? dinosaurs. So Arthur Eddington, and then that was a time when physics was going through really truly revolutionary breakthroughs. We're called the birth of quantum mechanics and subatomic particles and all these bizarre conclusions, if you're familiar with that. So there was all kinds of interesting, as I said, bizarre, completely counterintuitive conclusions scientists were coming to, that in the microscopic world, things are not really a state of being, it's a state of probability. And Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that you can never know the velocity and position of a subatomic particle at the same time, the observer affects what it's observing. Everything counter to classic Newtonian physics. And even Einstein had problem with these theories. So, but they were being proven again and again in the laboratories. As much as they were being resisted, because it didn't make sense, it was being proven again and again. Here's not the place to go into, but actually it's fascinating because it has a lot of parallels to mystical teachings about the soul. So Arthur Eddington came up with an analogy, and the analogy was a fisherman who spread his net across all the seas and gathered up different types of fish, different sizes, different colors, different species, you name it. And as he's documenting the fish that he caught in his net, he's writing all kinds of different statistics, and finally comes to a conclusion. You know what it is? That there are no fish in the sea that are shorter than a half-inch long. That's what his decision. That is his conclusion. And he's about to announce it to the wizards of the world when his little daughter, you know, like the story with the emperor with no clothes, looks at it and she says, "What do you mean? I've seen fish that are shorter than a half-inch long." He says, "No, my statistics show me there's no fish in the sea." That's it. So anyway, of course, the daughter, not being foolish, she went over to the net. She looks at the net, and the spaces between the strings of the net are half-inch spaces. So of course, all fish that were shorter than a half-inch fell back into the water. So he was right, and she was right. She said you should just use one additional line. When you use a net that has half-inch spaces, you'll never catch fish that are shorter than a half-inch long. You don't need a scientist for that. That you could figure out without any experiments. So what was his point? What tools are we using? If you're going to use your sensory tools, the conventional tools of observation, microscopes, other ways of measuring, you'll never be able to see an atom, and definitely not its bizarre properties. You need a different set of tools. So when we're convinced something is not real, it's because based on those tools it's not real. Just like half-inch fish are not real based on a tool called a net of half-inch spaces. But love. And I'll ask you a question. How do you know love is real? Maybe it's just a fantasy. Nature's trick to get you to breed with a person you think you love. Maybe love is just an illusion. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't touch or smell it. You know, it's not subject to the senses. So you say, well, there's other tools. And how do you know truth is true? What tools do you use to discover truth? If you basically look at it, almost every, I would say not almost, every value that means anything, has any permanence in our lives, is actually not subject to the sensories, to the senses, to the five senses. So the five senses essentially are the metaphorical net that will not experience something that it cannot contain or fathom. There was a city called Chelm.
Oh, yeah.
You know Chelm, right? There's one here too, somewhere in Brahman. Every city has its Chelm. So Chelm was this town, they say, of smart people, but the neighbors were jealous, so they created this whole folklore of the fools of Chelm. So there was this farmer on Chelm. He had a little farm. You can imagine Chelm was a small town. The farm was even smaller. And but he was very proud of this farm. He inherited it from his parents and from his grandparents and great-grandparents. So it was his baby. He knew every grain of soil. One day he gets a visitor from a big city farmer. What are the biggest farms in the United States?
Iowa.
Iowa? Okay, Iowa. Iowa's in the news lately. Yes, Iowa. Fine. The Iowa farmer comes and he shows him around, gives him a royal tour. They sit down to dinner. And he says to his distant cousin, the farmer, he says, "So tell me, what do you think about my farm in Chelm?" He says, "It's very nice and cute, but it's so tiny." The Chelm farmer is taken aback. "So tiny? How big is your farm in Iowa?" How is he going to explain to a Chelm farmer the whole town is smaller than his farm, which is thousands of acres? How is he going to explain it to him? So he finds a point of reference. He says, "My farm, let me tell you, It takes me all day to travel with my tractor from one end of the farm to the next. So the Chelm farmer suddenly, with compassion, looks at his cousin and says to him, don't feel so bad. I once had a tractor like that too. So what do you have? That he couldn't even fathom such a size farm. So he was sure if it takes him all day, the problem is with the tractor, not with this side. That he once also had a shmata jalopy that took him all day to crank up to move from here to here. So we all have our farms, we all have our nets, we all have our perspective. You want to think like a soul, you have to get rid of those stereotypes and those preconceived notions. Because souls don't have limits. It's all body, it's senses that are physical entities that think in terms of time and space in very defined ways. You want to know how the soul thinks? The soul thinks in infinite terms. There's nothing impossible. Because the soul is a flame. A flame is the closest thing that tells us what a soul is. And look at a flame. The only thing in the physical world that we can see with our eyes that defies gravity. Yes, helium defies gravity. You don't see it unless you put it in a balloon. A flame is always licking the sky. The only thing that keeps it grounded is the wick. And that's the analogy for the body. So the flame of God is the soul of man. That we were given a gift. That instead of being inanimate minerals or vegetables or animals, we have a feature which the Bible calls the divine image in which you were created. What did God do? Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. Well, once the verse before, Vayikach offer min Adam, he took earth from the ground, a clump of clay, completely inanimate, and what did he do? Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim. He breathed into it. He breathed God's breath into this piece of earth, and there you have a life emerged. A human being created B'Tselem in the divine image. And that's what's unique. We have the unique soul. Now just for the record, if it's not relevant to our discussion here, Arizal, Kabbalists, explained that there's a soul even in a mineral, and a vegetable and animal, but it's a different type of soul. We're talking about a soul that has divine features, that has ability to choose, and has the ability to change the world. The stone will always remain a stone. A stone will not conquer vegetables, and vegetables won't conquer animals. The human has the distinct ability to either elevate the world or, God forbid, destroy it. So this is the description of the Bible. Now you think about it, when you read it the first time, it sounds a little cryptic, but it's the best description of a soul. That is a soul. Neshama in Hebrew has another word, if you pronounce it a little differently, neshima, breath. Why do you see in so many exercises, yoga and others, breath is so significant? Because breath and soul are related. It's the breath of God that becomes our soul. And its feature is like a flame. So a flame licks the sky, a flame defies gravity. What does that mean in psychological and emotional, spiritual terms? That we're not driven just by survival. One of the Hasidic Rebbes once used an expression. He says, a behemoth, an animal, never saw heaven. Because animals walk on all four. I know people right away say, what about the giraffe? And what about some animals that can walk on two? You can train them. Yeah, but the point is, it's not just the walking on all four. An animal is not interested in what's going on in heaven. An animal is interested in surviving, in breeding, in protecting its young. And it does so, that's exactly what it's supposed to do. Perfect. Clockwork. I remember the first time as a hardcore New Yorker, the only animals we ever see are squirrels and cats, a few dogs, and some rodents. Yeah. Yeah, there are pigeons, there are a few other things. But real, So the first time I ever saw an animal was I went upstate New York, I'm driving there, I see a cow in the field. And I learned in Chumash about a cow. There's a behemoth, a cow. But I never saw one. So for me, a cow was a big thing. And I decided to pull up because I was fascinated by the cow. And I kid you not, I was looking at the cow, and it's like just grazes in the meadow all day long. Like it's going nowhere. It's never rushing. It doesn't need any therapy. It's not nervous. It's not anxious. It's what's called animal bliss. And it's perfectly satisfied. It does this day after day. I didn't wait for days. I got enough after that cow. I got the picture. I didn't need to wait around. And then I contrast that to human beings, especially in New York City. Everybody's rushing, and where they're rushing to, not necessarily for anything very important, but we're busy, we're always moving, going. So that's why animals are very happy in their habitats, wherever they live. You don't see them developing technologies, fax machines, smartphones, or better homes, 2 homes, 3 cars. You know, they don't smoke cigars, they don't drink cognac, and they don't do all that stuff. And as I said, also they also have no neurosis until humans get in the way. But that's another discussion. So that's an animal. Why? Because that's the way God created the animal. It does not bother. Human beings, even on the most basic level, you know, we've developed a $1 trillion industry called NASA to satisfy one thing: curiosity. Since we look up and we see the sky and we see outer space, we see stars and heavens and we see planets, it intrigues us. What's out there? Is there life? Is there someone like us? What's going on out there? Just curiosity. It developed many secondary industries that came out of the NASA space program. But that's human beings. We want to know, and we're always curious. That is, by the way, soulful. Su morim einechem, raise your eyes to heaven, v'ru mibara ela, and see who created all of this. We are curious. That is a soulful thing. That's a flame. The flame seeks. It yearns. It's never satisfied with animal bliss. So right there you have already the voice of the soul emerging. In any type of transcendent search, that's soulful. And that, by the way, does not necessarily mean religious. It doesn't even always take on the form of spirituality. It could be romantic, it could be music, it could be art, it could be anything that lifts the spirit to a place that's greater than yourself. That's the key. It's not about you. You recognize something greater than you are. In the Kabbalistic Hasidic literature, it's called bittul. That is the real operative tool of the soul. We'll soon contrast that. Bittul is a very interesting word. It's hard to translate into English because maybe the language doesn't tolerate the concept. But bittul is like a combination of humility, modesty, and the best translation I use is suspending yourself in face of something greater than yourself. It's what anyone would call when they stand before God. They stand in awe, in silence, and it could be through tragedy, as you beautifully, eloquently discussed earlier. It could be through joy, the birth of a child. You see, it's something greater than you are, something beyond. I know that's the basic, but that is a soul's voice. If you eliminate that voice, then we're back to simply dealing with survival, dealing with taking care of our needs, and it's about me. If it's about me or about someone greater than you are. I, for many years, till this day, give a class every Wednesday night. And it goes back to, talk about dinosaur age, it goes back to 1982. I want to just share something. The core group of the class were people that then, at that time, were from the art and entertainment industry. Mostly Jews, some non-Jews, but very spiritual people, but hardly from the tradition I come from. So it was very fascinating, our interaction, because we compared notes, and they would come week after week. It was informal talk, sometimes into the wee hours. And I realized that, as I said, we come from different backgrounds. Many of them would say their spirituality came from Zen Buddhism or a thing called, let's put it this way, it's not an acronym for Let's Start Davening, okay? LSD. Everyone knew that Let's Start Davening. Okay. Just like pot is not put on film. If you want a complete joke. Okay. And there's stories related to that too, but we'll save that for the break. Yeah. So I realized I was at a disadvantage, but this what happened here taught me such tremendous insight, which I want to share with you. I realized I was at a disadvantage because here I am sitting. I was a younger man, so I had a blacker beard and a yarmulke, sitting there looking to them as a traditional, orthodox, ultra-orthodox, or fanatic Jew, whatever they would call me, and they coming from their background. And I realized, and this is a key thing in all communication, is that it's not so much what you say, it's what you don't say, because people always stereotype you, especially if you have a look like mine. It's not neutral. I may remind one person of an angry grandfather that schlepped him to Shul on Yom Kippur against his will, or those ridiculous Seder nights where you just sat through and no idea why you're there. only because to make your family happy, or maybe even an abusive religious authority, or maybe good memories. But one thing for sure, it wasn't neutral. So I tried an experiment. This was a real experiment that was unbelievable. I decided, you know what, I'm not going to use any terms that are religious or Jewish in nature, because that's what they're expecting from me. I created my own terminology, whole language, spiritual language, and I went on like this for weeks. And I'll tell you the results in a minute. So what did I do? Instead of God, I used the word higher reality, or the essence of it all. Or if it was a particularly New Age group, undefined layers of cosmic energy or something. And instead of Torah, I used the word blueprint. Blueprint for existence. Instead of mitzvahs, connections. And instead of Mashiach and Geula, redemption, I used destination. And here I was, waxing eloquent and pontificating about the connection to the essence of it all by following a blueprint, a roadmap, and making these connections through all these interfaces and this glorious journey to fuse the undefined with the defined, form and function, soul and body, transcendence and survival, until we come to a place of total seamless unity, a destination where the inner and the outer will all be like one. Harmony, total harmony. And here I was going on, and I said everything that it says in the Torah, but I never used those words. A fellow came over to me after, I don't know if you remember Jay and the Americans in the 60s? Yeah. So one of the members, his name was Kenny, and he came over to me, and he whispers to me before the class, he says to me, "Are you talking about God?" And I never mentioned it. So I said, "Yes, but shh. Don't spoil it for the others." What did I realize? And I'm not, at this audience, I'm not concerned about. I realized that it worked much better than I expected, because once you strip things of words, words are loaded. Who knows what does the word Torah mean? I have no idea what you think Torah is, or what God is for that matter, and even what soul is. And I find that a big part of communication is not what you say, is to dispel stereotypes and myths. You'd be surprised if you get, that's 70% of the work. Get rid of that, and every one of us can connect. And I'm talking here to already a friendly audience. I've talked to hostile audiences. And when you can do that, that's where you create connection. You have to find a common language that is a soulful language. That's why I said earlier about transcendence. Transcendence, yes, for many it is in the form of religion and ritual and Shabbat and kosher and Yom Kippur and synagogue. But for many it's not. As a matter of fact, there's a statistic in the United States that says that over 90% of Americans believe in some form of God, soul, and spirituality. And only 40% associate with a religion. Think about that. Now, what does that tell you? It's not a small discrepancy. What's the meaning of it? Very simple. Religion is not seen as spiritual. Religion is seen as ritual. Maybe beautiful, but it's ritual, tradition, prayer, synagogue, community, family, seders, so on. Bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs. And spirituality, you know which words associate with spirituality for most people? I'll tell you words, not religion. Music, soul. Sometimes, yes, LSD. Or other forms of, let's call it psychedelic, or other states of consciousness, whether induced or not. And as a matter of fact, many people say the more religious the person is, the less spiritual they are. The more spiritual, the less religious. You ever see that or hear that? What does that tell you? That somewhere it lost its way. Because Judaism was always a fusion of body and soul. You think Abraham and Moses and all the great leaders and pioneers, they were deeply spiritual people. For them, ritual was like musical notes. You play music, that's how you get the soul. So I don't want to go into an analysis how that schism was created, how that dichotomy was even created. But I think it's important to note in a discussion of this nature, because you may have been exposed to some of this, and it's important to, again, separate. So let's go back. So how then do we identify soul in a healthy way, in a way that we can relate to in our own personal lives, and we can go away from here becoming more soulful people? I assume that's the purpose of this conference. Am I right, Rabbi? Yeah. Okay. So I think, go back to what I said earlier. There are two voices we have, absolutely two voices inside of you, anytime. So here's example one, anyone can identify this. Someone says to you tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., we need you to volunteer, we're going to visit some sick people in the hospital. So right there, two voices. You say, one second, I'd like to sleep a little longer. Maybe they can find somebody else. Or you go ahead and say, yes, it's a good mitzvah to do, I'm doing it. So I think everybody can agree which is the soul's voice and which is not the soul's voice, right? That's an easy one. And even when you don't always listen to the soul because sometimes you are tired. And especially when the guy tells you, the person calling you says, you know what, if you can't make it, it's also fine. Okay, there you go. Someone else can do it. You don't feel needed. At least he should have said, I need you. But so that's an easy one. Well, how about this one? You're walking down the street. I don't know if Arizona has these issues, but New York does. And you see a homeless person on the side.
Yes.
Okay. You see a homeless person tragically lying there, and they stick out their hand. And they ask for a coin or for whatever. What do you do? So most people would say that the compassionate thing to do is to give them something, right? And that sounds like soulful, The bad thing to do, which would be more the body would say, what are you doing on our streets? You're creating a nuisance. You could be criminal and all that. Most would agree with what I just said. But do we always behave in an altruistic way? We're always kind? Sometimes we may be in a bad mood and that person really gets on your nerves. And you may even know that they may be buying drugs with that money. And maybe we don't know. So you start making calculations. Are you really helping them? Are you not helping them? How do you determine what your soul should be doing and what your own personality is doing? In other words, do you think every time you feel compassionate, it's always your soul? You can be compassionate out of guilt or other reasons, or you're wired that way. I remember a guy coming to my class many years ago, and I was speaking about the difference between a good person and a person who does good things. A person who does good things, when they're doing something good, they're fine, but they could also be cruel a moment later. And a good person is 24/7 good, even when it's inconvenient. They will always be good. Even when they're asleep, they're good people. A guy came over to me afterwards with tears in his eyes. He was like in his early 50s. He says, tonight you answered a question that has been plaguing me since I'm a little child. My father was a very well-known philanthropist. He's wealthy, and people loved him. Tuesday nights, anyone can come to our home. Whatever they asked for, they got. Or he helped them in that area. Whether it was a loan, whether it was charity, whether it was get a job. He was the kindest man. But God forbid, should you come Wednesday night when he had his poker game, you weren't even allowed into the door, even if you're dying from hunger. And my father was many times quite cruel to myself, to my mother, to our other siblings. And as a child, you're confused, like, which one is he? And tonight I understood, my father did good things. He wasn't always a good man. His father probably also had a Tuesday custom. And I don't take away, my father was a great man, but it did not completely change him. It was when it was convenient for him. And when it wasn't convenient, he wasn't necessarily so. So you see, it's a little more complicated when you say, what's the soul? Sometimes we can package being good people, and it's not necessarily coming purely from the soul. It could be have another agenda. I'm not taking away, listen, giving charity even for ulterior motive has value, has great value. It not always has to be for pure intentions. But it just shows you that there's more going on than meets the eye. So what are our true criteria? So let me spell out a few criteria. I mentioned bittul. The first thing the soul thrives in is it's not about me. It's always about something greater than I am. You rest assured, anything in that nature is soulful. Now, whether it's full-blown spirituality or not, that really depends case by case. But that's what it is. It's the antithesis to selfishness, to me. So if Freud, in Freudian psychology, he associated and said that the core of the unconscious is the id, the selfish pleasure principle. It's about me. And it's only an ego and a superego that helps us navigate and coexist. Jewish psychology and spiritual psychology, it's a spiritual Jewish psychology, would say beneath the id is a yid, is a one. A pintala yid, a spark of the divine, that I said earlier, divine image, God's breath. And that is not about you. It's about the deepest pleasure is that you become more of a giver than a taker. So the body, the physical, the survival voice is a taker. And the giver is the soul is a giver. Now, as I said earlier, it could be mixed, but still, these are identifying principles. The more you can learn to identify soulful features inside of you, the more you're on your way to feeding it, because you don't know what to feed. And remember, we are now adults. Did we all grow up in homes where we were taught to nourish our soul as much as we nourish our body? The fact is no. I've rarely find someone that way. We may have grown up in a loving family and a functional family, but one that focused that the soul is more important than the body. Our schools don't teach us that. They teach us at best to know how to build a career, to make a lot of money, to be successful. But they don't say, listen, you have to feed your soul as much as you feed your body. We feed our bodies all the time. So now we're already in a life where it's not equally balanced. And yet, it's the soul that carries the secret to all happiness, to healthy love, to healthy coping with challenges, including tragedy, as we heard earlier. And this voice inside of us, this flame inside of us, is the one that's least nourished. So, the number one thing is you must remember that you have to nourish it as much as you nourish your soul, your body, and I'll give you some exercises I'll suggest. But I want to go back to more identifiable characteristics. I mentioned giving, taking, I mentioned bittul, something greater than yourself and yourself. Another characteristic, I use a Kabbalistic terminology. A soul comes to this earth not to be successful, not to make money, not to beautify itself, not to have influence. It comes here to change the world. Every soul knows that. It's in its DNA. So why is it that we're not involved in that? Because as I said, the soul goes undercover. When a child emerges from its mother's womb, the Talmud says, the child is made to forget the spiritual knowledge, the entire Torah that's downloaded into it during pregnancy. I'm sure you've heard that statement? Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating one. That means you have right now in your soul all the knowledge you need to accomplish your life mission. The problem is you were made to forget, so it remains in your superconscious, not in your conscious. What happens with our conscious? The conscious, we grow up in our homes, and at best, as I said, maybe a healthy home, but then life takes over, and most of our focus is on success in this world. How many of us think about our life's mission, our calling? We may wonder, why am I here? Everybody wonders. But how much time do you spend after you wonder doing something about it? Because then again, life takes over while you're busy making other plans. That's what happens to you, right? Life happens to you while you're busy making other plans. Who was that? Lennon? Okay. Yeah. An old sage. His name was Harav Lenin. Yeah? Today we have Rabbi Google. So, okay. So now we're contending with a reality that is out there and looking for that type of purpose. So soul knows it's here to achieve something. And what is it to achieve? The word the Kabbalists put it in I always loved it, very eloquent and very poetic words, that each of us is allocated with a certain amount of divine sparks that are embedded in every aspect of our lives. From the food we eat, to the drink, to the liquids we drink, to the places you live, to your job, to your every interaction, to your sitting here right now. God leads the footsteps of a human being in order for us to find the sparks that we need to discover. That's how a soul thinks. That's soul consciousness. The body does not think like that. The body thinks, what can I get right now? Instant gratification, what will make me happy and give me pleasure. It's not interested in big plans and doesn't think long term. The soul is all about the long term. Basically, what is the inner choreography of my life? Why was I led here? Why are we sitting here today? You may have all kinds of reasons. That might not be the main reason. Just to capture it, one of the most powerful stories that I always live with is the story of the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov, the great mystic, the founder of Hasidism. So he had a story with a man who was one of his students and also a great scholar in his own right. His name was Rabbi Chaim Rappaport. And it's a long story, but briefly, Chaim Rappaport, Baal Shem Tov sent him on a mission somewhere. He came back, mission accomplished. But the Baal Shem Tov was eager to know how he traveled. What roads did he travel on? So those seem trivial, and what difference does it make? But the Baal Shem Tov was very, very keen on knowing. So Reb Chaim told him. He said that one night I stayed in an inn. The next night I couldn't stay in the inn, so we were on the road. So I camped out on the side of the road. In the morning I woke up, washed my hands, said my prayers, and then sat down to have something to eat. There was a little spring of water on the side of the road. I went over, filled up a cup, I made a bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, shehakol niyeh b'dvarei. And the Baal Shem Tov jumped up and said, that spring of water was waiting from the beginning of time for you to come and make a blessing on it. Think about that. Think if we lived like that every step of our lives, whoever we meet, that is waiting from the beginning of time for you to say a kind word, share a mitzvah with, who knows, show friendship. You never know what it is. And it makes no difference if it's a friend or a stranger on a subway, you're commuting, even if you're going to a place you think you're going on vacation, how do you know? Always be open to the spontaneous, to the unplanned stuff. Because your plans can get in the way. That's how a soul thinks. That's soul consciousness, because the soul is looking for these sparks. But the soul has to contend with a body that's interested in other business. I have other interests. So the soul is purpose-driven. Another thing about the soul is not about self-gratification, as I mentioned. It's about giving. It's always looking, what can I do to give? This doesn't mean we're reckless and we don't take care of ourselves. Hillel said, "Imena mili mili, if I'm not for myself, who am I?" So that's also soul, recognizes that it has a unique contribution to make. But there's a second half. If I'm only for myself, who am I? Listen, we live, let's be honest, in a dog-eats-dog world, and many people talk about survival of the fittest. And although none of us, I'm going to suggest, live by that mandate, but it affects our lives because we live among sharks, and many times you need to survive. The soul is always thinking about how are we all different, how we each need each other, and how we not only take, but we also give. And this brings me to the next thing, which I think maybe I'll talk about more in the next session that I'm giving later, but just a key point, and that is the soul knows it's indispensable. Most of us do not think we're indispensable. We think 7.8 billion people on this planet. Who cares what you do? It's one grain of sand among billions and trillions. The soul knows that doesn't matter how many people are around me, doesn't matter how many big people. God put me here for a reason. Every snowflake has its purpose. To put it in more musical terms, each of us is an indispensable musical note in a grand, cosmic, divine symphony. Wow. And if that note doesn't play its song, no one else can play it but you. Not Moses, not Abraham, no one that ever lived can play your song. And just as you're indispensable, you know that every other soul is indispensable. So it's not like only me. When I play my song, then comes the next instrument or the next musical note, and it has to play its song. And if it doesn't play its song, I'm not complete. Can you imagine living with such type of awareness? You tell me from a psychological point of view, if we all knew that in our gut, not just heard it in a sermon or read it in a book. All these best-selling books tell you how important you are. But you know how good that, what effect it has? That's why they keep being bestsellers, because the other previous one didn't work. I'm an author, I can tell you. So the point being, imagine that psychologically, that you feel that, and I don't mean in an arrogant way, I don't mean in a selfish way, in a responsible way, that you have a musical note to play. It's unbelievable thought and concept. And I'm going to lead that into an exercise that I think all of us can do, and also do with others if you wish. But since someone reminded me, it must be in the room here, something you heard that I once said in a class I gave. Oh, there he is. Yeah. So my son came home from school. Now he's a 36-year-old man with 3 children of his own. He was 6 years old. He came home all excited. A child is excited. He came home. And I said, "What are you so excited?" He says, "I heard something really wonderful." What did he hear? He heard that you were born an original, don't become a copy. So, as a father, I was very proud. I was very touched. Anyway, years roll on. Recently, a while ago, I went over to him. Mendel is his name. I said to him, "So Mendel, remember that?" No, he doesn't even remember. And I said, "So what happened with you? Are you original or a copy?" And no pun intended, he happens to be a copywriter. So he says to me, he's good with words, so he says, "I'm an original copy," whatever that means. Okay. So you're original, and that you're indispensable. One of these sad poems by Oliver Wendell Holmes called "The Voiceless," And this tragic line, alas, alas to those that die with their song still inside them. Right? To those that die with their song still inside them. So, long before Oliver Wendell Holmes, this was the theme that God said, each of you I've created with a unique soul, your unique flame, your unique musical note, and a unique voice. And never, never, that the greatest sin is for you not to allow that voice to express itself. And it's difficult because we live in a world where conformity is almost demanded and imposed on us, whether it's conformity in your homes as children, or in schools, or society, or peers. So very often we lose our voice. And how many of you have a voice that you really have never fully expressed? I say fully. Now, I don't like to bring it up because it could be sad, but life is not over. You have a bright future ahead of you. And having the courage to sing your voice or use your voice is not easy. Because some people say, what's the matter with you? Why don't you just fit in? And so on. Now, I'm not suggesting you should all suddenly do things that will attract wrong attention, if you know what I mean. I'm not saying you go out there and become completely crazy, even if you want to. You have to, do it with a little intelligence, but it is the greatest sin if a person does not live up to their soul's mission. Doesn't matter what other successes. And most importantly, we all, hopefully, are all parents and grandparents, and we have relatives, and there are people growing up right now. Why shouldn't we be agents that help encourage them to express themselves? And this doesn't mean always being a disruptor and creating trouble, even though that doesn't hurt either sometimes. But it means being able to be confident. So here comes an exercise that I would recommend. And it may be an exercise you've heard of, maybe you haven't, but I know I've seen it work for myself. I've seen it work for many, many that I've suggested it to. It's actually not my exercise. It goes back thousands of years. It's a one-line prayer. It's the prayer we say as soon as we wake up in the morning. You can also call it, you don't have to call it a prayer. You can call it a chant. You can call it a poetry, a song. You can call it a meditation. It doesn't matter. It's not the word, as I said before. Let's not get stuck on words. And it goes like this. But I'll focus on the first half. You find it in any siddur, in any prayer book, and you can translate it any way you like. That's the Hebrew. Some people, Hebrew speaks to you, may not speak to you. But in simple English, it means this: I thank you for returning my soul to me. So let me paraphrase. You can fill it. You can express it any way you like. But here's one: I thank you for giving me an indispensable soul and giving me a unique mission in this world. And I will do everything possible through the day to live up to that mission, to realize it. So what have you done? You've set the tone before any business meetings, before commuting, before even getting dressed. You're still in bed. You've set your tone, you've set your mission statement for the day. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to go to work, and it doesn't mean you're not going to do other things, but you know what? You've created a signpost. You set something, a course, that whatever you do is maybe a means to some way expressing your soul. And maybe the world has been waiting from the beginning of time for you at a coffee break at your office to say something nice to your coworker. Or if someone's obnoxious, to not react in kind. Or whatever it may be, and it can manifest in so many ways. So it's a one-line prayer, and it's very short. But the impact, it can expand and throughout the entire day in every act you do. Now, I remember 2 years ago, where are we time-wise? That's good. A few years ago, I received a letter from, I send out weekly emails on our website, meaningfullife.com. Okay, let me plug myself, fine, since you did. Yeah, meaningfullife.com. You could find plenty of stuff there, a lot what I speak about here too as well. But let me say, so a few years ago, a woman writes to me, New Year is coming, Rosh Hashanah is coming, I love your stuff. Any suggestion for a mother with a bunch of kids that I can do this year, some new resolution for the new year? So, I was thinking, what can I say? And then, God always sends, as I said, divine providence. You never know. As I said, the soul is always looking. You have to always look for the providence in every detail of your life. A day later, I get an email from another person I know. She comes from France originally, now lives in Israel. And she had a very tragic childhood, a very wealthy home, but no love, very dysfunctional. And like what she called it, a gilded golden cage that was miles long, but it was a cage nonetheless. And till she was 8, she didn't even know she was Jewish, because her parents had changed their name. She sends me a picture of herself, brings me to tears even mentioning it. A picture of herself, she's like a 6-year-old girl. And with one line, one devastating line. What happened to this innocent child? She's asking me. You know, a beautiful little child. So I said to myself, there I have it. I have the exercise. So I wrote a little article, suggestion to parents or to anyone, what you can do for the new year. Pull out a picture of yourself when you were a little child, which in most cases will evoke innocent feelings, even though, to be honest, sometimes our childhoods were nightmares too. But let's assume that you had some beautiful things in it. And ask yourself, that little child is the closest thing that you are to a soul. Because when that child, you, I mean each one of us, emerged from our mother's womb when we were born, you were like freshly fallen snow. Remember, there were no human beings that trampled on you yet. You weren't abused yet. You weren't insulted yet. You weren't invalidated. And I'm going to go through all the types of abuse that we could endure. And even growing up in healthy homes, it's not always perfect. A newborn child is the purest version. Now in technology, an iPhone 10 is better than an iPhone 1. I would submit in human beings, 1.0 is better than 2.0, you know? And especially, like I always say, whenever my mother's in the audience, I always say, my best yeshiva was in my mother's womb. Because for 9 months I studied the whole Torah, and after that it's been all downhill, you know? So basically, our growing up is beautiful. We grow into mature adults, but let's be honest. You ever see a child breathing? Their lungs are working perfectly, healthy lungs. They heave up and down. Child doesn't have not absorbed toxins yet. And there's physical toxins, and there's emotional toxins, and psychological and spiritual ones. So reconnecting what they call the inner child is actually a concept that goes back thousands of years. That's why the Seder and Passover and Purim, every holiday, is about the child. Both the child, the actual child, and the child within you. Connecting to the soul before it became so jaded, or worse. So that was my suggestion. And the best way to do it is if you're a mother or a father, or an educator, or a nephew, or an uncle, or an aunt, is in the morning, don't just say to your children, I love you, and peg them up to school. Say, you are a special, indispensable soul, a gift that God gave me. And I'm the gardener. I don't own you, but I will do whatever I can to help actualize that unique soul that you have. And we'll do everything together through life to protect, to cultivate, to nourish, to validate, to reinforce all the confidence and the courage that you need to sing your song in this lifetime. Imagine every parent said that every morning to their child, and not just lip service. It'll create conversation. The child will start asking questions. So that based on that photo that young woman wrote and sent me, I made the suggestion, and I wrote it. Next year, and I didn't know who listened. Next year, that woman who asked me for the suggestion, and a few other people, more than a few, quite a few, wrote to me. It literally changed our homes. Because our children started asking, what does that mean? What do you mean? What does mission mean? I don't even know what is a mission. And at the dinner table, we became a conversation piece. Not every day, but it changed the language, the dialogue, the conversation in our homes. So the idea is actually completely a Jewish concept. I just translated it into a practical exercise. Now, obviously, that's just one suggestion. There's many others. And since I'm on it already, I'll mention one more for the evening, and then we'll wind down. Before we go to sleep, there's also a one-line prayer. There's the whole Shema that we say before bedtime. But then there's the last line there. B'yotcha afkid ruchi padisi esi keil emes. Which, again, translated, in your arms, I've entrusted my spirit. That's the beginning of that line. So what are you saying before you go to sleep? Very similar. In the morning you say, thank you for giving me my soul, and I will do whatever I can. And now, I want to give my soul some respite, going into sleep. It's not just falling asleep with a newspaper on your nose, or the television on, or with your iPhone in your hand and you're still sleeping, and when you wake up it's still there. But instead, why don't you go to sleep with a spiritual thought, a spiritual prayer, a spiritual poem? Give your soul some nourishment. It had already a whole day of plenty of aggravation in material survival. So now let it express, let it give voice to its transcendent nature. And then you have the two bookends, the morning and the evening. So your sleep can be a more peaceful one. And you wake up with that refreshed message, and you go to sleep with that message. I assure you that through the day, you'll begin looking for other signposts of where you can remind yourself there's a soul. Put a charity box on your office table. There's so many ways. Now, I'll let you figure out some other ones that you can do. In my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, I do have some suggestions, but you don't need to be very, just use a little imagination, a little creativity, and you can come up with plenty of ways to do for yourself, for your families, for children, grandchildren, friends, strangers. It's all about being aware. You're aware of your soul. It's like children, more than gifts and more than trips and more than awards, they need attention. It's like a flower needs water. Every soul needs nourishment, and nourishment begins being aware. The soul, all it wants is be aware of me and feed me a bit. I don't need much more than that. It's not even financial. The soul doesn't care about money. It cares about that type of value. That I'm inside of you, I'm beating inside of you. God put me there. I have an indispensable mission, a music, a song to play, an angel to emerge. And if we have that type of soul consciousness, that's the counterforce to what we call body consciousness. And this is not asceticism. This is not about ignoring your physical needs. We're talking about including and adding a dimension that enhances all your life because it's feeding the most important part of you, which is the soul that's beating right now inside of you. We all do that, and all the musical notes come together. We have what I said in that talk, we reach the destination. And the code language for redemption, for Geula, where all the musical notes of all people on earth, Jews and non-Jews, will play their musical notes, and we'll have one large symphony, a world filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. Thank you very much.